On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Irin Carmon. She is a reporter with MSNBC.com. Do I have that right?
Yep, that is all true.
Okay. I didn't want to improperly credit you or miscredit you. So, Irin, you've got two pieces that I want to discuss, and they're I want to Tale of Two Cities, not quite, but they're both ends of the spectrum in some respects. Let's start with the Abolish Human Abortion group, because we have seen the Republicans, particularly following 2012, but maybe this has been sort of a long-term agenda, to at least soften their rhetoric and their means in which to fight to rid women of this scourge of sovereignty over their own body. And there's some dissent within those ranks. Tell us about the Abolish Human Abortion group.
You know, it's interesting. Not many people have heard of this group, but they have 34,000 likes on Facebook. And last week, 35 different chapters around the country showed up at high schools to preach their uncompromising view of how all abortion should be banned. So it's as much as the mainstream, what calls itself pro-life movement, has seemed to have enormous success in red and purple states around the country. These guys are not satisfied. There's this general feeling that, that they should be going for everything all at once. You're right that there has been an attempt to couch the desire to ban abortion entirely in every circumstance as a sort of women's health thing, as a regulatory issue. They've talked about fetal pain. They've basically come up with all of these rationales because both the country and the courts are not ready to ban abortion entirely, and they're hoping that this kind of incremental strategy will just chip away piece by piece until there's nothing left. That's exactly what you're seeing in Texas. So the reason that Abolish Human Abortion is so interesting is because they're really grassroots and they're not involved in the political process. They say very honestly what they want, and they're intentionally provocative. They wear T-shirts that say, "End child sacrifice." They're not pretending to be warm and fuzzy and concerned for quote-unquote women's health. They are just saying what they want, which is, they think the anti-abortion movement should not make its peace with rape exceptions. They think even in cases of fetal anomaly, women should not have access to abortion. They think the morning after pill and daily hormonal birth control are tantamount to abortion. And these are not actually substantively so different from many of the mainstream organizations that get funding in D.C. or from the Catholic Church, but they don't have the political savvy or agenda to cloak it in more palatable terms.
Yeah, I would even say they have more, at least, intellectual honesty about it. I mean, I saw the report that you did for Melissa Harris Perry's program, and when you asked one of these activists, what should happen to a woman who gets an abortion, and he more or less said, whatever happens to anybody else who murders a person. And
absolutely. I mean, there's an integrity to it. Yep. I personally disagree with them, but I think that there's a real consistency, and there's an appeal to that kind of consistency that many politicians don't have the luxury to or the courage, you might say, or the extremism to exercise.
Now, so I mean, how long have they been up to this? In other words, is this been a phenomenon that has been existing and just sort of on a parallel track and waiting for someone to come and report on it? Or is the trajectory of this group growing, and will it ultimately clash with the agenda of the more savvy, I guess, conservatives who essentially want the same thing? They avoid answering some of the questions. But is this going to clash at one point?
They are a relatively recent group. Most of them kind of formed, again, because it's so decentralized and they don't even have a 501c3. They are not formally organized. Around 2012 was when they came together. But I think that the reason that they're growing is in the same way that in progressive movements you see how people are able to find each other, able to organize without traditional mediated power structures. They have the same thing. And, talking to them sometimes really feels like talking to a leftist because they have a lot of disdain for the institutionalized politics of the pro-life movement, as they call it. They call themselves abolitionists. They think pro-life is weak sauce. So there's a very interesting dynamic where they're actually more interested in influencing their own movement and dragging it forward to this kind of just objectively very extreme position than they are, in attacking Democrats. They're angrier at Mitt Romney than they are at Barack Obama.
Yeah, that was the question I had for you, is how much, who is it that they see is problematic, I guess, in terms of their agenda? And they see, and will they, ultimately, does this lead to them sort of, manifesting that feeling that they're more angry at the Mitt Romneys? Is this something that translates into electoral politics, or are they decentralized so much that they really aren't yet in a position to have any influence in that world?
They're less interested in electoral politics and more in influencing the people who have the ear of politicians. So I think, like any movement, it ends up getting influenced by the most passionate and engaged people. And these guys would consider success if the mainstream pro-life movement, as they call it, would stop talking about how rape exceptions are okay, and they think that a 20-week ban is a sellout, whereas a pro-choice person might look at that and find it very radical. There's also this dynamic where they think that the pro-life movement is like making a lot of money off their cause, and they are the pure, fully engaged guys. They do this. The people profiled in my piece that aired on the Melissa Harris Perry show on Saturday do this full time and live off donations.
And lastly, is it for them? Is it do they perceive this as a tactical? Are they seeing this as something as different in terms of like their tactics, or do they perceive people who are less extreme in their presentation? Let's say, do they see them as making too many compromises, or as just fundamentally compromised in their perspective on abortion?
They think they make too many compromises.
Okay.
But, I should say also that this initiative where they're outside high schools, and they have been outside of, I would say by now they've probably been outside of at least 50 high schools around the country. They see everything as a potential conversion. That's why they spend time with me. They think they could, last I spoke to them, they were still trying to convert me. So this is ultimately. Do
you want to give us an update on that?
I remain transparently and firmly pro-choice.
All right.
But there's an element of religious crusade to this, in addition to the political aspect of it. And I think that didn't come out as much in our piece, but I think they are very much the base of the anti-abortion movement, and they're really trying to influence the direction of it, which in turn influences electoral politics. Interesting.
You will, I guess, I trust, keep us updated on how that conversion is going. But I presume there probably won't be much updates, but who knows?
We shall see.
All right. Well, now they must be very distressed to see the piece that you wrote, if they hadn't seen it already, about what's happening in California.
Right. Well, there's a lot that's happening in California that is incredibly revolutionary. For the first time ever, they passed a law regulating abortion that had to do with medical science, that was based in a multi-year peer-reviewed study. showing that it is just as safe for nurse practitioners, for physician's assistants, and for nurse midwives to perform first trimester abortions. So just at the conclusion of the study and the law that they passed at the end of last year in California through the state legislature, they have added already almost 50 new abortion providers. So
I think we should pause here for a moment and reflect on the idea that it's news that a state legislature would actually promote legislation based on reachresearch in this day and age.
Shocking.
It is. I mean, but let's talk about what was. Tell us about what that that study was. It was. I guess a peer-reviewed study overseen by Tracy Weitz from the University of California. Tell us about what that study was and how it came about.
Well, there's this great operation at the University of California, San Francisco, out of the OBGYN department that is an interdisciplinary endeavor with sociologists, public health experts, and physicians trying to bring evidence-based research to the field of reproductive health, which, as we've just noted and is pretty evident in Texas, is a place in which, evidence gets checked at the door and ideology becomes really the prevailing motive for everything, no matter what they, say publicly. So they, in 2005, started a study that compared whether nurse practitioners, nurse midwives, and physician's assistants, if they performed early aspiration abortions, how safe that was compared to a physician. And what they found was that they were clinically identical in terms of risk. So as we know, physicians that provide abortions are targeted, they're stigmatized, there's violence, sometimes murder against them. So part of what they were trying to do with the study is to place abortion within the spectrum and the continuum of primary care and make it something that was less extraordinary and less difficult to obtain, and ideally have a dynamic where a woman could see the same person. And particularly if she lived in a rural area, access abortion earlier in her pregnancy if that's what she wanted.
So the idea here is to simply make these services, these reproductive services, part of the services they get on a normal, regular basis from their healthcare providers. And my understanding is that part of this also has to do with it's the flip side of providing evidence about how restrictive abortion laws actually hurt access and actually also raise the number of late-term abortions. Explain that dynamic.
Well, what San Francisco General Hospital, which is connected with the researchers in this study, what they were seeing is that women were often coming in later in pregnancy to have abortions than they wanted, that the later in pregnancy that you have an abortion, the more likely you are to have to pay more. There's a higher risk, even though it's overall still a very safe procedure. So I think that when they were trying to figure out what is happening here, what they realized is that the women were having trouble coming from rural areas in California. Despite the fact that California is a very progressive state, it's also an enormous state, and there are people there who don't have the means for transportation. So a place like Eureka, California, where I reported out my story, is, if you are past the cutoff point for an abortion there, which you can only get one particular day a week where the doctor comes to visit, you then have to drive 4 hours and pay even more money. And in the time that you're trying to raise the money to make that happen, it becomes even later and more difficult to get an abortion. And that's a very well-known phenomenon in people who work with women seeking abortion. So the idea is, you can lessen the stigma, make it in a less traumatizing experience to kind of have to go through this fundraising process by making it easier for women to just go to somebody that they know and trust right by them. So it means probably fewer later abortions. It means less stress on the people who no longer want to be pregnant, and just an overall kind of normalization of a procedure that is, in fact, extremely common already.
I want to reiterate this dilemma here, because in some ways it is fairly mundane in its practicality, but it has such huge bearing here, and I don't think that people fully appreciate this. I mean, it's also much harder, particularly if you live sort of in this corridor. The concept of having to drive or travel 4 or 5 hours for services that we take for granted, living in at least in more urban areas. So in Eureka, a doctor comes once a week. That doctor is equipped or I guess licensed or simply chooses only to provide abortions up to 13 weeks and 6 days, nearly 14 weeks. If you miss that week and you're 12 weeks, pregnant, then that's it. Ball game over. And, 12 weeks is not a lot of time to even be aware that you're pregnant, I guess, at that point.
Right, and you might discover something later in your pregnancy that means that you need to, that you want to end your pregnancy. I think overall you're looking at enormous barriers, just geographical ones, in addition to economic ones, language. So I think that the goal of this was to say, guess what? Women are having abortions for their own reasons, but they're encountering enormous barriers that have nothing to do with medicine. It's actually a very, very simple procedure. Another interesting thing that came out inadvertently from this study is that because they had such a huge sample size, they had 11,000 at the time of the American Journal of Public Health study, but by the end of the study they had 20,000 procedures to look at. And what they found is that abortion is even safer than they thought, had even fewer risks and complications in general than any other study had shown, because they had such a huge sample size they could really get a full picture of it. But for moral reasons, religious reasons, for moral judgments, there are still so many barriers to accessing this service. But women want it anyway. They're just being forced to suffer in other states that don't recognize that fact. And
so now, I mean, what are the when do we see the practical implications of this, this study broaden out? I mean, they received a waiver to provide those for nurse practitioners, et cetera, to provide these services. Is this something that we're now starting to see throughout California?
Yes. So the study was operating on a waiver, but then using the results of the study, they were able to pass a law that was signed by Governor Jerry Brown in October. And the week that I was in Eureka was being implemented for the first time. Now the nurse practitioners and other advanced practice clinicians that were trained in that study, they can now work on their own without doctor supervision, and it's now legal for them, for other people, other advanced practice clinicians who are interested in providing these services, to now be trained. So this also had to go through the legislature, and that is something that is really interesting because there was a Democratic supermajority in California, and there was a pro-choice governor, and the bill was sponsored by a powerful Democrat, Tony Atkins, who's now the speaker, at that point was the whip, who had formerly managed a bunch of abortion clinics and had really direct knowledge of this. So there were a lot of amazing and unusual circumstances that were aligning for this. But that said, California is obviously an enormous state that this is going to impact a lot of women, and it also provides a model for other states if the right terrain is right for this, to say, guess what, the sky didn't fall. This may have really helped a lot of women access medical care, and potentially fewer barriers for other states that may want to emulate this. And so, I mean, in the course of your reporting, was there anybody there who said to you, we anticipate by X date that this many more women will have access to this medical procedure, to an abortion if they want one, at the time that they want one? I mean, so in other words, the implications of this, I mean, does anybody have a projection as to what the implications are and when they'll be first be measured? And I assume, and maybe you know this, that somebody's also doing a study to see the implications of this broader rollout. I'm not aware of a specific follow-up study about this. That would be very interesting if that were going to happen. I'm not specifically knowledgeable about anything like that happening, but I think one of the things that they wanted to do was to make abortion less extraordinary. I think it'll be the phrase safe, legal, and rare that came out in the 90s, most famously with Bill Clinton, I think in some ways is a misstatement of the ultimate goal here, because rare can also mean that there's a woman who wants to enter pregnancy and can't. In Texas, abortion is now rare.
Well, I was going to say, this is the
think
mirror image of Texas. When we hear of all of the arguments about, well, we need to make this more safe for women, therefore we're going to put extraordinary requirements on the healthcare providers that is effectively going to do the exact opposite of what's happening in California.
It's absolutely the exact opposite, because it's in Texas, the medical providers are now required to get admitting privileges, which has nothing to do with actual safety. But I think what you'll find in Texas will be the mirror image. What you're already finding in Texas is the mirror image of what's happening in California, which is in California, when things are going well, maybe a public health researcher can pick up on it, but no news is good news.
Right.
There aren't complications. There isn't violence against providers. Women are just getting the care that they need and moving on. In Texas, unfortunately, what you're already hearing from medical providers down there is, unfortunately, women resorting to unsafe means or trying to obtain medication to end their pregnancies in illegal ways. So, just banning abortion is not going to make it go away, or making it very inaccessible will not end the need for abortion. So unfortunately, I think that Texas and California, the two biggest states, are really two sides of the same coin, and they're kind of funhouse mirrors of each other.
Are there any other states that, certainly there are states that are attempting and have implemented sort of a Texas-style regime to inhibit access to abortion services. Are there any states that are moving towards the California model?
From what I understand, there has been some interest from local activists, talking to how did you guys do this. Another part that would be great to know is that one reason that the California bill was able to pass through the legislature is that they had buy-in from great grassroots reproductive justice activists who were young, came from a range of communities, including the Latino community and the African American community. They really built a coalition along with the medical community, various nurses associations, to get this passed. So I think people know that the science is there. The political will is challenging. If they have heard from other states, but really the first question is, how did you guys do this? Because it's one thing to beat back a restriction, and it's quite another to pass a law that affirmatively expands access to what is still a very controversial procedure.
Well, is it that controversy that would inhibit advocacy groups from signing on? Because that seems to me like a fairly obvious thing to do.
I think more about advice about how do you get legislators to buy in.
Right.
That's the question. Not every state is California. Not every legislature has a majority whip who is sympathetic to this. So I think what they're actually trying, that the other states that are interested in this, first they could see how well it goes in California, and so far, again, no news is good news, and then they can take notes about how do you get a legislature to make that jump. Not because that jump is controversial to them, but because people are fearful of voting for quote-unquote more abortions.
And lastly, is there any sense that there was a political price to pay from those legislators? Because I imagine that's going to be one of the premier arguments, right? If you come back to your state and you say, look what California did. Yeah, it's California, but this guy's in a partisan index, 3, and it was fine.
Right. I think that there is, in California, it's notable that even in California, they weren't able to get it passed the first time that they introduced it in 2012. And that was there were lots of excuses around that, but I think it ultimately came down to the fact that it was an election year.
Right.
In 2013, they were further away from the election, and it was at that point that the study had been published, and there seemed to be fewer risks. But I'm not aware of any legislator who got in trouble in their district for voting for this.
Irin Carmon from MSNBC.com, thanks so much for your time today. Fascinating story, both of them.